I grew up hearing stories from the pages of the Bible. And now I'm searching for the places where they happened. This question led me to the ancient lands of the Middle East, searching for patterns of evidence that match the biblical events. I wasn't prepared for what would be revealed. For almost 2 decades now, I have traveled the world meeting biblical explorers. They have been searching for evidence of the Exodus journey, one of the most foundational accounts of the entire Bible.
Smell the coffee.
The aroma.
They've been looking for the true locations of the miraculous sea crossing and the mountain where God met the Israelites, Mount Sinai.
We'll break camp at 6:45 in the morning. We're at camp. We'll be on the way in about 7:15. And that right there is our destination.
I was intrigued by the fact that sometimes ordinary people, frustrated by mainstream scholars' claims that there was no evidence for these biblical events, took it upon themselves to search for archaeological proof. These explorers claimed to have found the remains of coral-encrusted chariot wheels on the bottom of the Red Sea. So what are your thoughts on finding proof for the Exodus?
I'm happy for the man who's trying, the people who are trying to, quote, prove the Exodus, in the sense that it's an adventure. It's a goal that, in my opinion, is unachievable in one's lifetime. No one else has been able to do it over the last 2,000 years.
However, investigating the Exodus journey brings up an even greater challenge.
There are many miracles in the book of Exodus. Whether the Red Sea parted is a miracle. Whether the 10 plagues happened is a miracle. Archaeology cannot prove or disprove a miracle.
When I look at the Exodus story through the eyes of a scientist, then it contains a lot of observations which just make sense to modern science.
Why is it important to think about these things?
At the end of the day, we're really talking about a miraculous event of unprecedented proportion. It isn't any wonder that the prophets constantly hark back to the land of Egypt and to the Exodus event, as it becomes a paradigm of God's miraculous saving power.
Over the last few decades, Dr. Barry Beitzel has been one of the most respected biblical geographers. He has published numerous books and articles on biblical geography, including the New Moody Atlas of the Bible.
To be able to flesh out some of the details of the miracle, and it allows an event to be placed onto the earth, so to speak. It's not just in our minds, it's not just a myth. It happened in time and space. And we're just trying to flesh out a little bit more of what that space might look like.
This story of the Exodus sea crossing is where it all began for me over 18 years ago. I can't explain exactly why I've been so taken with this account that I would risk my own business and personal life to explore these questions. I just knew it was something I had to pursue. And after all those years, I did find a pattern of evidence showing that the Exodus and conquest happened, and that Moses really could have written about these events as an eyewitness account. However, there are still major questions about where the Israelites traveled, what sea they crossed, and where Mount Sinai really is. In fact, after Israel gained control of the Sinai Peninsula in 1967, they searched extensively for evidence of their history. But no trace of the Exodus journey was found at the traditional locations. But have we been looking in the right places? If we can determine which sea was crossed, it could give clues about where to look for Mount Sinai. So now for me, the first issue in the Exodus journey is the Red Sea miracle. What sea was really parted, and could there still be evidence? One thing I've discovered in this investigation is that there are two main approaches that explain this event in very different ways. The first I call the Egyptian approach. It sees the events of the Exodus happening on a small scale and puts the sea crossing at one of the swampy lakes near Egypt's border. Those using this Egyptian approach tend to explain the parting of the waters by natural forces such as wind. This is by far the majority view among scholars today. The second view I call the Hebrew approach. It sees the events of the Exodus on a much larger scale and places the miraculous sea crossing far from Egypt, at the Red Sea's Gulf of Aqaba. This is because they emphasize the entire narrative of the Bible, which they believe geographically points to this location and describes a big miracle that could only be explained by the power of God. And some people I interviewed had a combination of both views. The difference between these two approaches is dramatic. One interprets the Exodus as very small, and the other as very large. This also applies to the question of miracles. Was it a big miracle, or was it a small miracle? Because where you put the sea crossing determines the scale of the miracle required. No one has done more to influence how I envision the Exodus and the miraculous parting of the sea than legendary film director Cecil B. DeMille. He created Hollywood's biggest biblical epic, The Ten Commandments, and he made it twice, the first time in 1923. The Bible says that a family of people called the Israelites spent centuries living in Egypt where they were enslaved. After 10 great plagues and the death of his firstborn son, Pharaoh finally agreed to let the Israelites leave Egypt under the leadership of a man named Moses.
Moses is one of the world's greatest human beings. And human he was to the point of sin, and holy to the point of seeing God, and receiving from him the law, by which men may live in peace and freedom, the Ten Commandments.
In 1956, DeMille remade the Ten Commandments into a 3.5-hour epic, which became a sensation. For the last 50 years, it has aired nationally on television during the Easter and Passover season. I traveled to Hollywood to meet DeMille's granddaughter, Cece, and I asked her about her grandfather's work. Why did he spend so much of his career making those types of films?
Because he loved the Bible. He thought the greatest stories were in the Bible because it's fascinating. You don't have to make them up, they're there.
DeMille's research influenced the depiction of these biblical events that shaped the culture's understanding of the Exodus for generations.
The wind opens the sea!
With its miraculous parting of the sea, where the Israelites walked between walls of water to safety, and God destroying Egypt's army, to Moses receiving the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. I can see why DeMille was attracted to this story, and it's why I'm attracted to it as well.
Behold his mighty hand!
Interestingly, DeMille's spectacular deep-sea parting was in line with the Hebrew approach. But was this biblical event really as miraculous as DeMille depicted? Or was that just a Hollywood invention? Dr. Glenn Fritz has been a competitive triathlete for more than 40 years. He is also an environmental geographer who has studied the question of the Red Sea location for over 2 decades. He takes the Hebrew approach, and over the years, I've interviewed him multiple times.
The interesting thing about the parting of the sea is that it had to be one of the greatest miracles that one could imagine.
Yeah.
Because the Bible says that the countries around them had heard about their deliverance through the sea.
Yeah.
Dr. Fritz published his thesis in a book, The Lost Sea of the Exodus. He believes that for centuries, scholars have misplaced key locations for the Israelites' journey out of Egypt.
Tim, the first question most people ask is, where's Mount Sinai? We want to know where this mountain was. My first question as a geographer is, where was the Sea of the Exodus? Where was this sea that was parted and crossed? And the reason I want to know that is because it gives me the direction of the route from Egypt, and it also gives me a big hint about the location of Mount Sinai.
Dr. Fritz has built a case that the sea crossed in the Exodus was far from Egypt, at the Gulf of Aqaba, and not one of the border lakes near Egypt. However, traditionally, there was a third option. Examining maps that were centuries old, I could see that they all put the Exodus sea crossing at the Gulf of Suez. This highlights the fact that for 2,000 years, the traditional understanding was that the north end of Suez was where the miracle at the sea took place. In the mid-1800s, the famed explorers Edward Robinson and Eli Smith searched for the route of the Exodus journey and believed they found sites that matched the Bible's account, all oriented again to a sea crossing at the Gulf of Suez. However, none of the Exodus locations mentioned in the Bible have ever been established with certainty. In fact, many maps of the Exodus route found in Bibles and atlases show question marks next to all the proposed sites. As time went on, scholars started to propose that the Gulf of Suez shoreline once extended much further northward.
Here's a map from 1891 showing the sea encroaching over the Isthmus of Suez. Here it says, ancient shore of the Red Sea, showing it inland. And this map shows an Exodus route crossing this ancient shore of the inland sea.
Yeah, why would they have thought that?
The first purpose was to bring the crossing closer to the land of Goshen. Then there was also the strong drive to have a non-miraculous shallow water explanation for using winds and tides so that you didn't have to have the miraculous parting of the sea. However, the geological history shows that at the time of the Exodus 3,500 years ago, the sea level was about a meter lower than it is now. And the land levels have not changed geologically in that particular area of the isthmus.
So there couldn't have been that theory.
These theories of crossing an inland sea literally don't hold water.
Was there a naturalistic way to explain this miraculous event? At the same time, these shallow water Exodus views were becoming vogue, naturalistic thinking was also taking hold in other fields. In the early days, many archaeologists wanted to find evidence to prove the Bible. In part, this was in response to threats from a new theory with evolutionary ideas. I went to the Petrie Museum at University College London. Egyptologist Chris Naunton is the former director of the Egyptian Exploration Society and the current president of the International Association of Egyptologists.
I know that biblical archaeology was one thing that people were looking for in Egypt.
Yes, the very earliest archaeologists working in Egypt, some of them at least, were particularly interested in identifying sites which could be connected with the Old Testament narrative. You have to remember, I think, that many of those people came from the Western tradition, they came from Christian societies, and we're also, certainly in the second half of the 19th century, in the period when there was a reaction among some elements in the scholarly community against Darwinism, which was seen as a kind of threat to Christian beliefs. And so there was a counter-reaction to that to try to establish evidence that the Old Testament narrative was real.
Over time, attitudes in the scholarly community became more skeptical toward the Bible. In the late 1800s, the prominent German Egyptologist Heinrich Brüsch popularized a new theory that was a major development in the Egyptian approach. He proposed that the crossing was not through the Red Sea's Gulf of Suez at all, but at a shallow lake north of Suez. However, not all scholars at the time were persuaded by this thinking, including Charles Beek, one of England's preeminent geographers. After meeting with Brüsch, Beek was not impressed with his use of Egyptian inscriptions to determine the location of the Exodus Sea crossing. Beek believed that the Bible clearly put the crossing at the Gulf of Aqaba. And it was in the deep waters of Aqaba that the Exodus explorers were searching for the remains of Pharaoh's army on the sea floor. Yet over time, an Exodus crossing site at one of the shallow border lakes became the standard view of biblical studies. In 2002, I traveled with Exodus explorer Dr. Leonard Moeller.
Even this lake is suggested. I don't understand that, but that is also a suggestion.
He's a Swedish DNA research scientist who wrote the book, The Exodus Case. He takes the Hebrew approach. We were investigating lakes on the border of Egypt that have been proposed as potential crossing sites.
It's a very shallow lake, and it's filled with many small islands.
A question that comes to mind is how a crossing at one of these shallow lakes fits the Bible's claim that it happened at the Red Sea. In the original biblical Hebrew used by Moses, the name of this sea was Yam Suf. Yam does mean sea, but scholars agree that the word Suf in Hebrew does not actually mean red.
The miracle of the deliverance of Israel occurred at the Red Sea. That's what our English Bibles say. And we get that understanding, Red Sea, comes directly from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The word for red, ironically, the word for the color red occurs more frequently in the book of Exodus than in any other Old Testament book.
Oh, really?
If Moses had wanted to say the Red Sea, he had a Hebrew word right there, the same word that he uses for some of the dye in the tabernacle and some of the dye in the high priest's clothing and so forth.
But he doesn't use the word.
He doesn't. He doesn't use the word red, that's right.
The term Yam Suf, which was the sea or the body of water that was crossed by the Israelites, has never been translated into English. The first time that Yam Suf was translated was in the Septuagint, which was the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek in 250 BC. The Septuagint work was done in Alexandria by a group of about 70 Hebrew scholars, but they were Hellenized Hebrews, and they also had Greek geography as the basis of their understanding of the world. Now, these scholars, when they came to the term Yam Suf, instead of delving into it or transliterating it, they translated it as Red Sea. A Red Sea was basically the only body of water that was thought to exist adjacent to Egypt.
Since Red Sea was just a geographical interpretation by the Septuagint translation, I needed to know more about the original term. If the Hebrew Yam means sea, the question remains, what does the word Suf really mean? This would become one of the key questions of the entire investigation, because how one defines Suf can determine where one locates the crossing and what type of miracle that would require. In 2002, after my first trip to Egypt, our film crew stopped in England to conduct a series of interviews. The first was in Liverpool with Professor Alan Millard. He is one of the leading experts on the languages of the ancient Near East, and he has authored many books, including Discoveries from Bible Times. He takes the Egyptian approach. Let's talk a little bit about the word Yam Suf. Tell me, what is the definition, in your opinion, of that word?
This is a Hebrew expression, Yam Suf. The word Yam is the Hebrew word for sea, as a body of water, not necessarily an ocean. And Suf is a Hebrew word, probably borrowed from Egyptian, meaning reeds. So the Sea of Reeds is the proper translation of that expression.
Everyone in the Egyptian approach accepts this Sea of Reeds definition for Yam Suf. This highlights the fact that there are three main terms used for the Sea of the Exodus that have developed over the centuries. Placing them on the wall of time, I could see that first came the Hebrew word Yam Suf. It shows up in the book of Exodus around 1450 BC, and it has always been called Yam Suf in Hebrew to this day. Then this location name was identified as the Red Sea in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Finally, some scholars began to translate the Hebrew term Yam Suf as Sea of Reeds. For a long time, it was thought that this Sea of Reeds was the same place as the Red Sea at the Gulf of Suez. But a significant change came with the birth of modern Egyptology, which in time would be incorporated into the Egyptian approach to the Exodus. The Egyptian group started to look at connections between Egyptian and biblical words, especially the name Yam Suf, which they connected with an Egyptian location named Patufi, which means the place of reeds in Egyptian, and was in the Nile Delta. They believed this fit well with a Sea of Reeds definition for Yam Suf, and it also lined up with the fact that the Red Sea has no reeds. A spectacular miracle at a deep sea is what I learned about growing up, and it appears to be what DeMille was demonstrating in the 10 Commandments. But if the common view today is that the Red Sea miracle was through a shallow lake that could be explained by natural causes, it makes me question what God's role would have been in this scenario. Or do I need to change my understanding of how God works in the world? I grew up in a family that for generations believed that these biblical accounts were true. Now, my own grandchildren will be asking questions about the Bible and these miracles, because the Exodus is filled with them, and I want to give them a confident response. As in my past films, I decided to take a closer look at the Bible to see what it was actually saying. Was there a pattern of evidence that fit either of the two main approaches? Looking at the text, I could see that this question is about time and distance. I identified 6 primary steps of the Exodus journey. Zooming into the wall of time during the year of the Exodus, I can place the 6 steps of the journey during a period of around 7 weeks from the time when the Israelites left Egypt, crossed the sea, and arrived at Mount Sinai. The text reveals a departure point in Egypt that the Israelites left from, a direction that was taken toward their initial goal, a desert that was crossed before they arrived at the sea, a detour that was taken off the main road that ended at a dead end, a deep sea that the Israelites passed through, and a destination for the journey, a mountain called Sinai. The first step of the pattern is the departure point in the land of Egypt. The book of Genesis records that the Israelites were a family that descended from Abraham. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land, but they would multiply like the stars of heaven, and God would bring them out to inherit the land of Canaan. Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, was enslaved in Egypt before rising to power, allowing him to settle his father Jacob and their entire family into the best part of Egypt, a place called Goshen, where they multiplied greatly. In 2002, I traveled to Egypt, into the ancient land of Goshen, to meet with one of the world's foremost Egyptologists, Manfred Bietek. He had uncovered archaeological evidence of Semites underneath the city of Ramesses, mentioned in the Bible, at an older city called Avaris. But the first time I interviewed Bietek, I was startled when he told me that there was no evidence for the Israelites in Egypt. It shook my faith. Now, however, I had just learned Bietek had found new evidence related to the Israelites' departure point. I was meeting him in Jerusalem at the courtyard of the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. I admit, I was a little bit nervous. It's so good to see you again. And you probably don't remember, but in 2002, I was sending you emails, but I think I was sending them to the Institute in Austria.
And you didn't get answers? Or?
No. And so I came unannounced. I surprised you. At the time, you were very gracious to me. And so we did a 5-minute interview. And I said, is there any evidence of the Israelites? Is there any physical evidence of a Hebrew population that you can...
So far, not.
So far, not. And it was like I was hit by a 2x4.
But to connect this with the Proto-Israelites is a very vague affair.
Does any of that come back to you?
It's shrouded by mist.
Yeah, yeah. Eventually, I came home, and I had a crisis of faith. And that experience with you started me on a 12-year journey. And I started looking for what would be called a pattern of evidence. Here we are again, and I want to talk to you, ask you a few more questions. I wanted to ask Manfred about the region around Avaris, where the Israelites first came to live, and where their departure out of Egypt in the Exodus would eventually take place. What was his new evidence? Do you see a place where the Israelites could have lived?
A very exciting evidence comes from the region of the Wadi Tumilat. The Wadi Tumilat is a very old connection between the eastern Nile Delta and the Sinai. And I was able to prove that the western half of Wadi Tumilat was an enormous overflow lake because it was fed by a Nile branch. Mm-hmm. And it was a kind of basin, an enormous basin, 18 kilometers long, 1.8 kilometer width. And what is most interesting, and Sarah Groll
pointed it out, there is a lake in one of the Ramesside texts called Gesem.
Bitek was referencing research done by the late Egyptologist Sarah Grohl and her work with Semitic toponyms. A toponym is a technical term for the name of a place, and the Israelites spoke a Semitic language, Hebrew. Sarah Grohl had identified the name Gesem in ancient Egyptian documents that she believed were connected to this area and to the Bible.
And indeed, in the Septuaginta version, Goshen is written as Gesem.
So here was another clue. The name Goshen was called Gesem in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament.
Gesem is a Semitic name tied to a big lake, and can only be this lake. And from Ramesside times, you have several more Semitic toponyms there.
So this is very interesting because what you're suggesting is that there's Semitic toponyms in Egypt.
Yes.
And why would they be there?
Why did Egyptian scribes, for heaven's sake, use Semitic toponyms for an area which belongs to Egypt?
Yeah.
It can only mean that there were people living there, the majority even, who spoke Semitic language.
In an earlier film, I was told that Avaris had over 30,000 inhabitants, and there were at least 20 other Semitic settlements in Goshen that haven't been excavated yet. This fits the Bible's claim that the Israelites had multiplied and spread throughout the land.
A new Pharaoh arises, and he doesn't remember Joseph. He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives building store cities of Pitom and Ramses and makes them create bricks out of mud and straw.
Here we have the name Pitom tied to a Ramesside document.
So this would be Ramesses?
Ramses.
And this is?
Pitom.
Pitom, okay.
And I think that one should not mistrust the story of the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt. I think there is packed inside a story which may have an historical background.
After years of thinking that Bitek couldn't find evidence for the biblical account, I was surprised that he was pointing to powerful connections that confirmed the Bible's historical record for the presence of the early Israelites. The Bible states the Israelites left from the city of Ramesses. This establishes the specific departure point of the Exodus journey. However, this verse also touches on another important and controversial issue that affects every aspect of the Exodus journey, including the size of the miracles involved. The text says that the 12 sons of Jacob, who became the 12 tribes of Israel, had grown to a tremendous population of about 600,000 men. If this were true, when you add in women and children, it would likely mean a total population of over 2 million. Many find it hard to imagine this many people crossing the wilderness. This is why most in the Egyptian group favor much smaller numbers for the Israelites. It has to do with the Hebrew word Aleph. Associates for Biblical Research, ABR, have been searching for evidence matching the Bible in Israel for over 4 decades. Currently, they're excavating the location of Shiloh, where the Bible says the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant were located for centuries. Dr. Bryant Wood is the former director of ABR, and he favors the Egyptian approach.
This matter of numbers, large numbers in the Old Testament, is a very, very thorny issue. But I think clearly it has to do with our understanding of the Hebrew word Aleph, which is translated 1,000.
So if it says 650 Alephs, then that would mean 650,000.
If you take Aleph to mean 1,000.
Right.
I believe that in these early accounts that it must have another meaning. We find, in fact, that there are some places in the Old Testament where it's translated chief, it's translated clan. I like the translation unit better. One scholar who looked at this recently is Colin Humphreys in England, and he concluded that it was about 20,000 people total that left Egypt. And I think that's a reasonable figure. And of course, if you use the translation of 1,000 for Aleph, you come up with 600,000 men, which would mean, several million Israelites leaving Egypt. And I think that's an impossibly large number.
Most scholars I've interviewed in my investigation favor much smaller numbers for the Israelites. And I have to admit, this is part of the story that I've struggled with the most. How could so many have survived in the wilderness? So I went to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary to hear from the Hebrew approach. Dr. Jason DeRushi is co-author of A Modern Grammar for Biblical Hebrew. We spoke in the Spurgeon Library.
I know that some people would say, well, there were probably 5,000, maybe 10,000 Israelites, maybe 20,000 Israelites.
What people are wanting to do is narrow this language of Aleph in the census list, which are only about the military men, 20 and over, narrow that to mean a military company, a military grouping. But if we do that, we end up with very, very small Israelite population. What's clear in the biblical text is that there has to be enough Israelites in order to make Pharaoh and the rest of Egypt scared. Exodus chapter 1. That they were multiplying in such great ways, thus being faithful to God's promise, and bringing fear to the Egyptian army.
If the Israelite population had grown like it's written, then it would have been a fantastic miracle, and it would have been just what God had promised Abraham, that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky on their way to inheriting the promised land. This is in line with the Hebrew approach. What I found curious was that I too have come from a large family with 12 tribes like the Israelites. I have fond memories as a child spending summers on my grandparents' farm. Playing with my cousins, I began to realize I was a part of a much bigger family. My Swedish grandmother, Esther, was one of 10 children. She met a Norwegian immigrant, Edward, and they married. They went on to have 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls, which would eventually grow into 12 family clans. People in the past just had larger families. My grandparents ended up having 46 grandchildren, who've now created several hundred relatives.
Here we go.
If the Israelites multiplied like my family, then I can see how they could easily get to over 600,000 men while in Egypt. There are several places where Moses uses the Hebrew word Aleph that indicate it was operating with the normal meaning of 1,000. For instance, in the book of Exodus, Moses tells about an offering taken at Mount Sinai.
Each man from 20 years old and upward was to contribute a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel. The rich could not give more, and the poor could not give less. And the number of half shekels collected came to 603,550.
Then there was the census taken at Mount Sinai.
God told Moses, "Take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel by clan, by fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male, head by head." Each tribe listed their numbers, and the total of the 12 tribes was 603,550.
When the numbers for each tribe in the census are translated with Aleph meaning 1,000, They add up as expected. How then do those in the Egyptian approach come up with smaller numbers for this census?
You always have 1,000 figure followed by a number. The word for 1,000 has more than one meaning. In the Bible, it has more than one meaning. If you take those groups, instead of saying 54,400, you would say 54 clans or families totaling 400 people, 62 clans totaling 700 people, and so forth. Then instead of having 603,550, you would have 598 groups totaling 5,550 people.
I could see that if you add up the census numbers using the meaning of clan for Aleph rather than thousand, it does not match what the Bible references. And totaling up the hundreds column does not add up either. Is the fact that these numbers are adding up perfectly when translating Aleph as thousand just a coincidence?
You know, a lot of people have a really difficult time that there were millions of people going out. They think, well, how could that many people exist in the wilderness?
Sure, but in even raising that question regarding their existence in the wilderness, it fails to account for the text itself, which says miracles were happening over and over again. Miracles of manna from heaven, water from a rock. God didn't let their sandals wear out. A single pair of shoes for 40 years. Good night. It's a miracle.
Yet Dr. Beitzel stresses that taking Aleph to mean clan rather than thousand would not be changing the wording of the Bible.
If you were to divide up the word Aleph in that way, you're not changing one vowel point, you're not changing one letter in the Hebrew Bible. You're just taking Aleph in a non-numerical sense rather than in a numerical sense. I'm not saying that this is an explanation that lies beyond questions. But I am saying to you that in my view, this is the most cogent alternative view. It doesn't answer all the questions.
Right.
If it answered all the questions, we wouldn't be sitting here even discussing it.
We wouldn't.
Again, if we have a view that God is big and that Scripture is true, it demands that we understand He's able to sustain millions for 40 years through wilderness.
I now have evidence matching the first step of the sequence, the departure point. References to Lake Gessen, matching the place named Goshen, in the region where the Bible states the Israelites lived before leaving Egypt. This name is not Egyptian, but Semitic, matching the language family of the early Israelites. Evidence for the biblical cities of Ramesses and Pithom, which are also found in Egyptian documents. And there are at least 20 additional Semitic cities that have yet to be excavated that would potentially increase the Israelite population greatly. The Bible states that the Israelites departed on the Exodus from Ramesses, earlier known as Avaris, a location both approaches agree on. As hard as it is to imagine, the Bible seems to be pointing to about 2 million people departing Egypt. If this is what the Bible is telling us, and if I'm believing the Bible, then I have to believe this was possible. I thought the big miracle was going to be the parting of the sea, but in reality, I'm learning that the Exodus journey is full of miracles, including how God sustained so many people. The next step in the pattern is direction. It begins with Moses and a burning bush.
The Bible states that Moses was born into an Israelite family at a time when the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians. There was a decree from Pharaoh that all the male Israelite babies were to be killed by throwing them into the Nile River. And in fear for his life, his mother hides him in a basket and floats it among the reeds of the river Nile. But God is watching over baby Moses. And Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe in the Nile. She finds him, adopts him, and names him Moses, which means drawn from the water. He was raised in the household of Pharaoh and educated in the Egyptian court. Moses went out one day to his people and looked on their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian and killed him, and hid him in the sand. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, where for 40 years he tended sheep. And then one day God revealed himself to Moses and spoke to him out of a burning bush. God told Moses to return to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to release the Israelite slaves and bring them back to this mountain that he was standing on to worship God.
This gives us a clue to the direction step. The initial destination of the Exodus journey was not the promised land, but rather a mountain where Moses encountered God during his 40-year stay in the land of Midian prior to the Exodus. The traditional view is that Moses encountered the burning bush at a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula, but was this the land of Midian?
One of the questions that people have always asked is that if you look at the biblical story of the Exodus, you see that Moses went to the land of Midian. All right, now the land of Midian, where is Midian? Midian is actually in Saudi Arabia. It's not in Sinai. It's not in what is today Transjordan, and it's not in Israel or Palestine. It's in Saudi Arabia.
One thing scholars are pretty much agreed upon is that Midian is in southern Jordan and in northwest Saudi Arabia. They have found distinctive pottery, whereas in Sinai, you really don't have anything from this period.
In 2003, I traveled to northwest Saudi Arabia, the ancient land of Midian, with a small group of Exodus explorers, including Dr. Leonard Moeller and Dr. Glenn Fritz. At that time, few had been allowed into this area, and many felt it was dangerous. There, I had the opportunity to see a mountain called Jebel Alaz that some suggest might be the true location for Mount Sinai. So was Moses in the land of Midian when he encountered the burning bush? Some think so and believe there's still evidence that can be found there today. But many scholars maintain that Moses traveled outside of Midian to the traditional Mount Sinai. Either way, this gives the general direction the Israelites would head when leaving Egypt, southeast toward the mountain where Moses had met God.
Back in Egypt, Moses confronts Pharaoh and gives him God's command to let the people go. But Pharaoh refuses, and Egypt experienced a series of devastating plagues.
Moses is the agent of God in the story who will wreak havoc against the gods of Egypt.
Dr. DeRushi then told me something startling concerning the character of Pharaoh that Moses was facing. It goes back to the Garden of Eden.
That serpent in the garden, we're told, will have offspring who will look like him, who will act like him, who will be murderous and liars like their father was, the devil. And Pharaoh is being portrayed as an offspring of the serpent who embodies all the characteristics of the serpent himself. And therefore, he is a portrait of the devil in the story, the evil one who is working once again hostility against God and seeking to defeat God's people.
Only after the 10th plague, Pharaoh relented and thrust the Israelites out of his country.
Moses said to the people, never forget what Yahweh, your God, has done for you in delivering you out of the clutches of Egypt. God was being faithful to the promise he made way back 400 years earlier to Abraham, that this day would come, that after 4 centuries of affliction, God would deliver them and bring them out with great glory.
In 1923, Cecil B. DeMille was the first to portray the Exodus departure in a spectacular way.
They left Egypt with their flocks and herds and headed east across the wilderness toward the mountain of God. A pillar of cloud and fire led them day and night. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although it was close. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and want to go back to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward Yam Suf.
Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 says, when you leave, do not take the way to the land of the Philistines. Well, we know that the Egyptians had a whole series of forts along that road. That's the equivalent of an interstate highway in antiquity. At this point, it's just simply saying, you may not use that road.
Yeah.
All right, that suggests to me they're going to be following a regular road. There were only 3 options, but now, with this one out, according to Exodus, one is now left to 2 options. Okay.
And that's this option right here?
This one goes across the middle part of the Sinai. This one goes, this is the way to Shur. This is the road that goes to Jerusalem.
Professor Beitzel's Egyptian view suggests the Israelites traveled on the way to Shur. However, the Bible says they traveled on the way of the wilderness to Yam Suf.
The Bible says that the Israelites took the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And in these days, highways were identified by their destination. It's just like if you're in Dallas and you're going to travel to Chicago, I'm going to say, I'll take the highway to Chicago. When they left Egypt, they took the highway to the wilderness of Yam Suf.
There was really only one way to get to Midian, and that was to follow the Trans-Sinai Highway. That was a direct route. It was a well-traveled route. So it looks like Moses is simply following the way he had traveled to go to Midian.
I went to see a distinguished professor of Hebrew who has written extensively on the Hebrew Bible. Professor Duane Garrett authored a commentary on the Exodus and co-authored a modern grammar for biblical Hebrew, along with Professor Derushi. He also has a Hebrew approach.
If you look at a lot of ancient maps, the Gulf of Suez is the Red Sea. What's happened to that thinking?
It's not really, in my view, compatible with the narrative, which says they got on the way of the Yam Suf and they crossed the Sinai Peninsula to get to the Yam Suf. Whereas if you put it at the Gulf of Suez, they cross the Gulf of Suez and then they just start wandering down to Sinai, and they don't spend any time on the way of the Yam Suf. So it does not fit the narrative. The Bible says they went the way of the Yam Suf, which I think clearly is directly across northern Sinai to the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba, is an extension of the Red Sea, and I think that's what they crossed.
What I've learned in the direction step is that Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt in a southeasterly direction, and there were only 3 main roads to choose from. The Bible states that they did not take the northern route, the way of the Philistines. That leaves 2 other options. The central route went to the deserts of the Negev on its way to Jerusalem. The southern route went to an arm of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, which was on the way to Midian. If Moses was in Midian when he encountered the burning bush, it would make sense that he would have returned on this road back to Mount Sinai. This is the Hebrew approach, but most in the Egyptian approach disagree. This leads to the next step of the Exodus journey, desert.
When the children of Israel left Egypt, there were 600,000 men of military age, plus their families. A pillar of cloud and fire led them into the wilderness. And the mission was to bring the children of Israel back to Mount Sinai, where God first spoke to Moses. Moses and his brother led the people out of the land of Egypt, and they were on the way of the wilderness toward Yam Suf.
Which desert wilderness did this road pass through on its way to the sea? The Egyptian approach suggests this small desert next to Egypt's Nile Delta, but the Hebrew approach believes the desert area was much larger, in the Sinai Peninsula. Egyptologist David Rohl wrote Exodus, Myth or History. We've traveled together several times into the Middle East looking for patterns of evidence that match the Bible. Although David is not a person of faith, he believes the Bible represents historical events, but he doesn't accept spectacular miracles. Rohl uses the Egyptian approach, which focuses on toponyms or the names of places in the biblical text. This approach believes these terms connect to Egyptian meanings and locations.
I think if we're going to take this Exodus route seriously, we need to look at something like a satellite image like this and try and work out where they went.
Well, I know that we've got many different theories about this with a lot of different locations, but so what do you think the crossing site, where would that be?
Well, for once, I'm going to follow the conventional argument here. So let's start over here in the land of Goshen.
In the area of Avaris that you're talking about.
Absolutely, here. And it's in the Fertile Delta. And then once they've crossed the Yam Suf, they travel down the other side through Sinai until they eventually reach Mara here, the bitter lakes or the bitter waters. And we have a number of toponyms along the way which match the story. We have Elim down here, which is the place where the 12 springs are located and the palm trees. That's even today called Ain Musa, the springs of Moses. And then we get in here to Sarabat el-Kadim. This is the biblical Dofkat, which the Egyptians called Mofkat. And we work our way down to Sinai. And so you have a number of toponyms in Sinai which match the story.
The majority of scholars, including Dr. Beitzel, use this approach, and their focus on Egyptian connections for biblical place names results in their placing the sea crossing close to Egypt. In contrast, scholars using the Hebrew approach generally see the Exodus as much larger, including everything from the numbers of Israelites to the size of the miracles to the distances involved, because they think this is what the full weight of the biblical information is describing. The Hebrew approach acknowledges that some of the words in the Bible have Egyptian connections, but it focuses on the Bible's full description of events and on Hebrew meanings of biblical place names rather than Egyptian connections.
The most natural context for us to understand the meaning of words is first in Hebrew. And what's significant, I think, is that the Bible is given to us in Hebrew by Hebrews, telling us the story of God's delivering of them. And so it seems very natural to me that we would take this ancient book at face value and allow the Hebrews to tell us what they experienced, point by point, location by location.
Examining the biblical text closely, I could see that Moses identified 3 campsites the Israelites stopped at after they left Egypt and before they crossed the sea. The first was Sukkoth.
And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children.
The second was Etham, and the third was at the Red Sea, which in Hebrew was Yam Suf.
So, David, tell me, what do you think the route of the Exodus was in your mind?
Well, we know that Goshen is over here in this area. And we know the first campsite is a place called Sukkoth in the Bible, Hebrew Sukkot. Now that's Tel El Maskuta, or Masukot, it's the same name in Arabic. And that's across here in the Wadi Chumalat. So they came down from Goshen across this triangular desert here to a place called Sukkot. Now, this triangular desert is actually mentioned in the Bible. It's called Midbar Yam Suf, or the desert of the Sea of Reeds. So the Sea of Reeds has to be somewhere close to this desert here, and that's where the Bala Lake system is located. So I'm very confident that this is the Yam Suf region here. So they cross this desert. They come down to Sukkoth.
And they set out from Sukkot and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness.
And at that point, they then journey to a place called Etham. Now, Etham's a bit of a mystery. Nobody really knows where it is. And in fact, if you think about it, if Etham is the word for Egyptian Hetem, which is the word for border fortress, there would have been a big garrison of Egyptians sitting there.
In the Egyptian approach, all these events leading to the sea parting seem to be taking place in a very small area. Was this the desert wilderness the Israelites really crossed, or did they cross a much larger wilderness? There's a big difference between these two options.
Well, some people are proposing a crossing over here.
That's true, but if you look at the distances involved here between Sukkoth over there, then you have to have Etham over here, and then you have to have the third camp over here. We're talking 250 miles in that distance. It's just too far.
Too far. Numerous times I've traveled into the desert, and I can tell you that with a lack of food and water, combined with the extreme heat of the sun, it's a very dangerous place. So where does Glenn Fritz place the desert route in his Hebrew approach?
This is a map of my projected route from Goshen to the seashore of Yam Suf. There were two encampments listed on this route, Sukkoth and Edom.
Over here.
The route is designed to follow the wadis, the lower-lying areas in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula.
And explain what a wadi is.
A wadi is an Arabic term meaning valley. The thing to keep in mind here, in leaving Egypt, the goal of the Exodus was to go to the mountain of God. Moses, in his thinking, would have planned on rounding the head of the Gulf to get into Arabia.
Because he was heading to Midian.
He was heading to the mountain of God. Then they encamped on the edge of the wilderness, and while they were in Edom, they had avoided this steep downhill, heavy terrain between their campsite and the head of the Gulf.
So this here is the
head of the Gulf of Aqaba. This is an antique map showing this heavy terrain, and they camped just shy of this area.
If the Hebrew approach is correct, how would a multitude of people cross such a wilderness? Could Moses' leadership be part of the answer? This was something that DeMille also noted in his research.
The Bible omits the first 30 years or so that brought Moses to manhood. To fill in those missing years, we turn to ancient historians, such as Philo and Josephus. Philo wrote during the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth, and Josephus wrote some 50 years later. These historians had access to documents long since destroyed.
The Jewish historian Josephus recorded that in his early life, Moses was a general that led an Egyptian army into battle against the Ethiopians. This campaign may be what Stephen the Martyr was referring to in the New Testament book of Acts, when he not only says Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, but also he was mighty in his words and deeds. I set off for an ancient castle in Austria, Schloss Klaus. It has guarded this valley for almost 1,000 years and now has become one of the homes of Torchbearers International, a Protestant retreat and educational center. I went there to interview a leading German Exodus Bible scholar who has spent most of his career studying the life of Moses and the event of the Exodus. His name is Peter Wiegand.
So his Egyptian time in Pharaoh's court really groomed him in a number of ways, didn't it, for the upcoming Exodus?
Of course. Well, Tim, God has various degrees of calls for people, of callings in their life. Now, if God calls a person to a job, if God calls someone to become a doctor, he'll need a specialized training for that.
Mm-hmm.
If God calls someone into a filmmaker, he needs certain qualifications for that. Now, if you are to become a general of an army or become a leader of a nation, there are to be certain basic trainings, and you can't be an idiot.
You couldn't.
Well, there have been enough of that sort, but God, when he chooses his person, he chose a highly intelligent man.
Mm-hmm.
And he chose a man who knew how to behave, and he chose a man who knew how to use words, issue commandos, and organize things. He had to issue, this has to be done now, and it has to be done without reserve, you go. So he had to know how to command whole troop segments, how to train his officers.
Moses' training may have included things like military intelligence, logistics, preparation of supplies, and managing the resources an army needed to survive. This would have uniquely qualified him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and across the desert. In 2002, I traveled with Dr. Leonard Moeller and a film crew on this ancient road to Midian across the Sinai Peninsula, where the Hebrew approach believes the Israelites traveled. What we observed was that the terrain was not sandy like the Sahara Desert. It was much firmer, almost like concrete in many areas. However, the Egyptian view does not think crossing this desert is realistic.
If you try and go straight across the Sinai here, you're in this limestone area called the El Tik Plateau. Now, that is extremely dry because limestone absorbs the water, so it's a very dry desert.
Do you think it would be hard for people to make it across the way of the wilderness to Gulf of Aqaba?
No, because it was a regularly traveled caravan route. It was a trading route. Now, they wouldn't want to waste time, and they wouldn't want to dawdle, but it's not as though they were out in a trackless wilderness. It was, in their terms, a highway.
Mm-hmm.
Movement across Sinai is not as difficult as people might imagine because the distances are not nearly as great as many people might assume. You're not going through mountains, you're not going through deep valleys. It's a very easy route if there's water.
Let me show you something. There are 3 counties in Southern California: Los Angeles, Ventura, and Santa Barbara. They have a combined width of 150 miles, which represents the approximate width of the Sinai Peninsula. According to ancient rates of daily travel, this distance would easily be covered in a week to 10 days.
If I could get an idea of how many days the Israelites traveled and how many miles they covered each day, it would help determine which desert was crossed, and if it was possible to cross the Sinai Peninsula.
How far could the Israelites have gone in a day?
Through the desert?
Yeah.
Well, many people would argue not very far. But when you look at what Robertson and Smith managed to do, they averaged 2 miles per hour. And they were walking. They put all their pack materials on the back of the camels and they actually walked.
So a Bedouin would walk through this territory at 2 miles an hour. So that means in 11 hours of daylight, you would get 22 miles a day.
The question is whether the large group of Israelites could have matched this pace.
The Israelites left with all their possessions, with their families, the elderly, children, and their animals, their flocks and their herds. They must have water and they must have food. And so you have to, as you're going along, provide for your animals. And this slowed them down. And if you look at records of nomadic peoples that travel around with animals, a realistic distance of travel would be about 6 miles a day, 10 kilometers a day. That would be about all you could cover.
Well, for example, you go on walks, and I go on walks with my wife, and we walk around the lake, and the lake is about 3 miles. We can walk around that lake in about an hour.
Take that walk with a bunch of little kids, a bunch of old people, and a bunch of animals that need to have water and food, and try it again.
I went to see an American professor of animal science at Colorado State University and a leading consultant to the livestock industry. Her name is Temple Grandin. In 2010, her own autism story and its insights on animal behavior were captured in the feature film Temple Grandin, starring Claire Danes.
The Exodus story is about the Israelites leaving Egypt and going distances. What kind of distance could sheep or cattle or oxen
Depends
go?
upon what kind of condition you want them in. I was just looking at something the other day about the cattle drives. I mean, you might go just a few miles each day because you want to let them water and feed. If you want to maintain the body condition of the animal. If this is an emergency situation, you can go a lot further. The big thing is they have to have water.
So how often would animals need to be watered?
Every 3 or 4 days at them. You know, and then that's under emergency conditions.
Yeah.
And if you've got the right kind of sheep, they could probably go longer without water than the people could.
I traveled to Tennessee to meet the Baker family. They raise a unique type of sheep known as Jacob sheep. Tradition says these sheep are descendants of the spotted flock Jacob bred, as recorded in the book of Genesis.
What is unique about this particular breed?
Jacob sheep are an older heritage breed. They trace their lineage back into the Middle East to this area of Syria.
So it is possible that this breed could have been the sheep of Jacob, from the descendants of that.
So it's true that these guys could be related. They're easy keepers. They don't take a lot of grain. They don't take a lot of water.
How is it to herd these sheep?
It's not difficult. Sheep are followers. They have a strong flocking instinct. If you can convince 2 or 3 of them to come where you want them to come, the rest of them will be there.
I was impressed with their strength and speed. But how far can sheep travel in a day?
Could sheep go 15 miles or 20 miles?
Oh yeah, you could move sheep 15 or 20 miles if you had to. In an emergency, you could just walk them as fast as you could walk, but they wouldn't have time to graze. They'd lose body condition. They'd start to get skinny, but they can last a long time and still live.
Because then they could fatten up once
They can fatten up once they get there. That's right. They could get really skinny and still live as long as they're getting water.
Yeah. Could sheep then go several hundred miles?
Whatever the people can walk.
Yeah.
If the people can do it, the sheep can do it.
So distance isn't a problem. But how could the Israelites have had enough water? I found out when I was in the Sinai region.
Basically, it's gotten a lot worse right now. So the question of, would there be water in the wilderness?
This time of the year, we are in the Sinai region now. And I haven't been out long, and I'm getting wet.
Yeah. Whoa. I'm a little bit concerned by the lightning, too.
Don't be concerned about it. It won't hit you.
As you can see, this is the runoff that's come down from the mountains, from the storm. So it seems real feasible that in this time of year that there would be water to support this crossing across the Sinai.
Even the scriptures talk about rain provided for the Israelites.
O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, rain in abundance, O God, you shed abroad, you provided for the needy.
There was another important clue about distances that could be covered. In the book of Genesis, Jacob fled from his father-in-law Laban with his children and large flocks and herds. They covered a distance of 350 miles in 10 days, averaging 35 miles a day. So the Bible is telling us that ancient people with kids and animals could quickly cover a lot of territory. But speed is only one half of the equation. The other is how many days the Israelites traveled to the sea. This could determine how large of a desert was crossed. God told Moses to make a list of all the camps of the Exodus journey. He recorded that it took 1 month to get past the 6th camp and around 50 days to Mount Sinai. The Egyptian approach makes the case that the sea crossing happened after just a few days.
In the actual evacuation of Egypt, they come to the body of water in the 3rd day.
However, the Bible does not give the specific time to the crossing.
Josephus, when commenting on this, I realize he's not inspired, but there are times when his words at least are relevant. He says, in 3 days, Israel went from the beginning of its migration to Baal Zephon, where the miracle of the Red Sea occurred. That has to be close to Egypt.
Now, some people have said that the Bible stipulates that it took them 3 days or it took them 7 days to reach the crossing. I don't see that in Scripture, that there was any time frame to reach the encampment by the sea. But the total trip being about 250 miles, if they covered 20 or 25 miles a day, moving quickly, traveling day and night, they could certainly reach this point within 10 days. And that would be probably a good figure. These people were fit, they were slaves, they were used to working 7 days a week.
The difference between 3 days and 10 days is the difference between a crossing at the border lakes and a crossing at Aqaba. Moses' information actually allows the crossing to have happened somewhere between 3 and 24 days into the journey. This is what the timing looks like in the Egyptian view, with the first 3 camps squeezed into the first 3 days. But since Moses recorded that it took exactly 1 month to get past Camp 6, in this view it would mean that the next 3 camps were covered in the remaining 27 days. But a Hebrew view argues, since it was 1 month to Camp 6, is it not reasonable that it was about a half a month to Camp 3? The Israelites would have traveled a long way in 2 weeks. However, proposing that the desert crossed was Sinai brings a challenge from those using the Egyptian approach.
And bear in mind something else that's really important too. Etham is described in the Bible as being on the edge of the desert. Now the edge of the desert is over here. It's not right over here on the far side of the desert, so Etham has to be over there too, in which case you've then got 250 miles all the way to the 3rd camp.
David is making a good point. If the 2nd camp of Etham really was at the near edge of the desert closest to Egypt, it would be a problem for Aqaba. The question is, which edge of which wilderness is the Bible talking about?
Tim, you were wondering why I would pick this area for Edom.
Yeah.
Now, the area that I theorize as being Edom was a popular encampment in antiquity. These green dots represent Chalcolithic and Bronze Age settlements.
So this whole area up in here, huh?
Yes. Settlements made even before the time of the Exodus. But the remains archaeologically show people were camping in this area because it was suitable. It had water and pasture, and it was flat. The wilderness of Edom is a term that we have to understand to know why Edom was called Edom. In the Arabic, Et Tihama or Tama is the coastal zone of the Red Sea in northwest Arabia. And Tama or Tahama is translated as land sloping toward the sea.
You know, when you and I have been there, it's magnificent when you're there. You see these beautiful mountains coming.
Dropping right into the water.
Right, and then when you realize that it's thousands of feet deep into the sea, it's really a mountain range with water in it, right?
Yes. Again, Moses used very general geographical descriptions. Large areas of terrain, large landscapes were used and given a simple name. And so when he uses the word Edom, this is the last stop you can make before you make this descent through the rough terrain around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. And then they stopped on the edge of the wilderness to encamp at Edom.
In the desert steppe, the Egyptian approach sees everything happening on a small scale in the desert area north of Wadi Tumalat. The first two campsites, Sukkoth and Etham, are thought to connect with place names in Egypt, the second coming at the near edge of the wilderness of Sinai. This view also favors slower travel rates and only a few days to the sea crossing. In contrast, the Hebrew approach sees the wilderness as much greater. It has the Israelites crossing the Sinai Peninsula before reaching the sea. This view is open to faster travel and has many more days to get to the sea. Glenn Fritz proposes a different edge of the wilderness for the second campsite of Etham, coming just before the Gulf of Aqaba. I have to ask, which approach best matches the account? The Bible says they left Egypt in haste and traveled day and night with God's miraculous provision. When they got to Mount Sinai, God told Moses,
"You yourself have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself."
These scriptures seem to fit the longer distances and faster speed in the Hebrew approach for the desert steppe. The next step of the Exodus journey was a detour taken off the main road that ended up at a dead end on the shore of Yam Suf.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi Hachirot, between Migdol and the sea. In front of Baal Zephon, you shall encamp facing it by the sea."
What would the Egyptian view's explanation be for this turning back that sent the Israelites on a detour?
The verb to turn is used hundreds of times in the Bible. And what it means is you can turn north, you can turn south, you can turn east, you can turn west, you can turn just about any angle.
Doesn't it say they turn back?
Well, turn back would be the same verb. Where the verb turn is used, I think it would be better to render it veer.
So it's possible that the reason why Moses turned back here is because there was a huge garrison of soldiers at this point and he couldn't go through there. So he had to turn northwards and go north towards the area where the Yam Suf is located.
But having Moses and the Israelites go north toward the Mediterranean seemed to contradict the Bible's account that said they did not go on the way of the Philistines.
But the Hebrews, when they left Egypt, did not go by the sea route.
They were told not to go that direction.
They were told not to go that direction, as stated in Exodus 13:17.
One thing I want to bring up is that it says that they weren't supposed to go north. It says they weren't supposed to go the way of the Philistines, which is along the Mediterranean.
Well, yes, of course, because that's the danger zone. That's the way of the Philistines up here. But that's what is meant by they turn back. They turn back into the danger zone. God orders them to turn back. They don't go straight on. They can't go straight on because of the fortress here. They can't go further south because of all these lakes. So he tells them to go northwards. Why is he doing that? It's because he wants a confrontation between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. He wants to teach the Egyptian army a lesson.
Once again, the Egyptian approach emphasizes natural explanations, whereas in the Hebrew approach, the detour was not caused by canals or threat of a fort, but simply because God ordered Moses to turn off the main road and follow the pillar of cloud to the sea.
My view is that they made it out of Egypt with no problem because they had permission to leave. They didn't have to dodge forts. They didn't have to worry about the lakes. They just went around the lakes and went past the forts because the Egyptians wanted them out.
After the detour, the Israelites reached a dead end at the sea crossing itself. DeMille's 1923 version of the Ten Commandments portrayed this event for the first time. As a filmmaker, I'm still impressed by what he was able to achieve cinematically almost 100 years ago.
The Bible records that Pharaoh changes his mind, pursues the Israelites with his chariots, and they catch them at the shore of the sea, trapping the Israelites.
In the Exodus, the Bible states it was Pharaoh's chariots that were cast into the sea when God caused the waters that were parted to crash down upon them. This was how Cecil B. DeMille depicted it in his second film, based on his research, which was quite extensive. This is what it might have looked like in the Hebrew view. But how would the Egyptian approach explain the dead-end aspect of this step, where Pharaoh trapped the Israelites at the sea? At the Karnak Temple, there's an inscription that depicts a fort along a waterway with reeds in the Nile Delta. Some think this relief offers a clue to the location of the dead end where the Israelites were trapped at Yam Suf. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer and geologist Stephen Mosher used this inscription along with satellite information to locate the dead end in an area known as Bala Lake. They also propose that there are Egyptian place names here that connect with 4 biblical place names that any view of the Exodus sea crossing must account for. These places are Pi-hahiroth, meaning mouth of the canal or mouth of the gorge, Migdol, meaning tower or fortress, Yam Suf, the sea that was crossed, and Baal Savan, meaning Lord of the North, likely a place of worship for the god Baal. So what you're suggesting is that there's a crossing in these border lakes right here. How did you come up with that?
Well, it all began by my interest in this very famous depiction on the walls of Karnak Temple, which show the Pharaoh Seti I, who was the father of Ramses II. And what we have here is a 3,300-year-old road map containing the forts from Egypt's frontier, depictions of forts and their names stretching across northern Sinai all the way to the land of Canaan. This shows us water. We have pictures of lakes. We have pictures of reeds growing out here, but all of this is desert today.
The reeds depicted on the Karnak inscription connect well with the popular Sea of Reeds definition for Yam Suf.
So as time went on, as we studied these inscriptions and other Egyptian papyri, suddenly there were names on these documents that compared very favorably with what we have in the Bible. Back in 1975, Professor Manfred Bietak from the University of Vienna proposed that this area was known in Egyptian texts as Patufi, which means the marshlands, the watery area full of reeds, and linguistically, this word tufi does correspond to the Hebrew Yam Suf. And this is why I pulled Steve into this, because I needed somebody who could understand the sand, the dunes. Where were these ancient lakes in what is now all desert?
Earlier, Professor Mosher had introduced me to declassified spy satellite images of the area from the 1960s Cold War.
But we can see the delineation of an ancient lagoon back here that set into the coast, and we found river traces that take us into a depression which was called the Bala Lakes, and this is a possible location for Yam Suf.
If we looked at this land today, it would be covered with agriculture, and we wouldn't see all of the details that we could see 40 years ago on the ground. In fact, look at that straight line. That is the Mediterranean coast during the time of Ramses and the New Kingdom throughout the Bronze Age.
How does it relate to the story of the Exodus?
The significance is, on that Karnak relief, the third fort is called Migdol, the Migdol of Seti I. That name Migdol is what piqued my attention, because in Exodus 14:2, there's a site called Migdol, which is by the sea that the Israelites crossed. And Migdol means fortress or tower. A colleague, Dr. Ellen Morris of Columbia University, she wrote a 900-page dissertation on these forts, their functions, their locations, etc. And she concluded that there was likely only one fort named Migdol located in the northern part of Sinai in the New Kingdom. It's not like there were Migdols all over the place.
And then we have the other clues. For example, the canal system that was discovered by Israeli geologists back in the 1970s may have a link to the Exodus itinerary.
Yeah, Israeli geologists discovered traces of a canal right here, and in my research, I began to look at the biblical texts, because there you have in Exodus 14:2 a place called Pi Hahirot, which means the mouth of the canal. And this is beside the sea that they pass through. That word Harot is an Akkadian Babylonian word for canal. This is a man-made feature, not a natural feature. And so suddenly, the realization that there was a canal on the frontier of Egypt became something very interesting to us.
And you think that the toponyms, the names that are used for these areas, match the biblical narrative?
It does. So we have Migdol there, we have the sea to the north, and we have Baal-zephon at a place called Tel Dafana over here. Now, that was a major temple of Baal-zephon, the god Baal-zephon. So all those three toponyms locate Pi Hahiroth, the crossing point, right in the middle.
I asked Professor Hoffmeyer, how did the Israelites end up at this dead end at the Bala Lakes?
They come to this area, and they're on the edge of the wilderness. They're about to leave Egypt. Exodus 13:20 tells us, and then suddenly they make a turn. Exodus 14:1 and 2 indicates a turn, and the word shuv means to turn back. Did they turn more to the east or a little bit more to the west? But clearly they're heading back to the very area they were originally trying to avoid.
So we have a potential location for Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. We have Migdol, we have Pi Hahirot. That's the compelling evidence that this is the location.
However, I also noted in the Bible that God told Moses that the southern border of the Promised Land was at Yam Suf, which historically has always been the Gulf of Aqaba. This is a big problem for the Egyptian approach. As a Hebrew scholar, Professor Garrett also challenges these connections, especially in the north, because of the Bible's command not to go the way of the Philistines.
Well, I analyzed his arguments pretty thoroughly in my book. And in my view, I mean, Dr. Hoffmeyer is a great scholar, but in my view, he's just not correct. He has them making movements that the Bible says they didn't do. Even his geographic layout of the lakes and the fortresses is not compatible, in my view, with what the narrative says.
When I reread the verse about the dead end, it said the Israelites were to camp between Migdol and the sea. This would put the Migdol fort behind them and the sea in front of them. But in this Egyptian proposal, the Migdol fort was not behind them.
He has Israel on the other side of the lake, and so it doesn't really fit the narrative.
I also found that not all Egyptologists agree that these biblical place names can be linked to Bala Lake. Professor Donald Redford is one of the world's most respected Egyptologists. He was given the award for Best Scholarly Book in Archaeology for his work Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times. He notes that some of these sites didn't exist until long after the Exodus.
The reference to Baal-zephon is a late reference. It doesn't go back very early. And Pi Hahirot, if we have identified it correctly, belongs in the 4th century. That's a late period site. I don't know how Jim can deny it. But at that point, if you agree, and I don't, but many people do, that Suf, Yam Suf, is Chufi, meaning the reeds. and it borders on P. Ramesses. So at that point, they've come all the way around. They're back where they started, right next door to P. Ramesses. It doesn't make sense.
Because of the northern route prohibition in the Bible, some in the Egyptian approach, like Dr. Beitzel, propose lakes further south, which would require a different Migdal. Beitzel suggests it's an Egyptian fort near Lake Timsah.
And when you add that to the prohibition to follow this established road, I think what it means is they got down to this established road. And it was at that point, somewhere around Migdal, that the miraculous event took place. Here you see the way to Shur. There's Timsah Lake. Up here's where they started at Ramesses. This is out. That road is out because of Exodus 13. This road is not out, and in fact, you have the same three sites, Bing, Bing, and Bing, in the same sequence. To me, this means that the most reasonable choice would be the body of water that intersects the road to Shur. I have singled out Timsah Lake as the point where I think it took place.
I noticed that all the different Egyptian proposals for Yam Suf have different Migdals. It makes me wonder if Egyptian place names really demand a crossing near Egypt. So where does the Hebrew approach suggest the detour to a dead end occurred? After leaving Egypt and crossing the Sinai wilderness, there are three proposed routes that lead to the Gulf of Aqaba. One leads to the northern tip, the second to the center, and the third to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. But if the Gulf of Aqaba is Yam Suf, why hasn't it been considered as the Sea of the Exodus before?
The reason that the Septuagint assigned the Red Sea term to Yam Suf is because it was the only body of water adjacent to Egypt or Arabia recognized by the early Greek geographers. The Greeks were the geographers par excellence of 2,000 years ago. However, they failed to recognize the existence of the Gulf of Aqaba.
The case Glenn was making was that although the Gulf of Aqaba existed in ancient times, it was not included on maps made by Westerners.
Now, evidence of this lingering problem is seen in some relatively modern maps. In this map from the 17th century, you see the Red Sea, but we do not see the Gulf of Aqaba. Geographers long continued to interpret the Red Sea and the Gulf of Suez as a single shaft of water adjacent to Egypt, but there's no Gulf of Aqaba. Here's another example from the 18th century. Here we see the Red Sea, but guess what's missing? The Gulf of Aqaba.
For me, this was incredible. An entire sea was misdrawn and left off maps for centuries.
This misunderstanding continued as a tradition into the 1800s. Here's the point. If the Gulf of Aqaba was missing through much of history, how could it be identified as the biblical location of Yam Suf?
Well, that's interesting. If the ancient understanding was that the Israelites crossed the only known sea on their way to the mountain of God, what happens if a previously unrecorded body of water called the Gulf of Aqaba is inserted in its true location? It might easily shift Mount Sinai to the other side of Aqaba, into the ancient land of Midian, the area where Moses lived for 40 years. This is where the Exodus explorers have been searching for evidence of Mount Sinai and diving in the Gulf of Aqaba, looking for the remains of Pharaoh's army. But before Aqaba's true extent was known to the west, the traditional sites were already set in stone. I went to the University of Cambridge to interview Sir Colin Humphreys. He is a highly awarded physicist working in the field of material science. Humphreys also believes the Exodus crossing site is at the Gulf of Aqaba, as described in his book, The Miracles of Exodus. I asked him about 19th century English geographer Charles Beek, who was one of the first to explore the Gulf of Aqaba as the crossing site.
Speke was a great explorer.
He's from England, right?
He's from England, that's right. A great explorer and renowned for being an explorer. And in fact, he got the gold medal of the Royal Geographical Society, which is the highest award an explorer can get in England. And he believed that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. And I didn't know this when I started my research. And we're sitting here in Selwyn College, and Selwyn College Library has the original book, which he started to write and his wife finished. And it's this beautifully bound volume, and it's called Sinai in Arabia by Beek. But because of his work saying that Mount Sinai was Arabia, he was regarded as a heretic, and his gold medal was taken away from him.
They took his gold medal away from him? Was his gold medal for something else?
Yes, his gold medal was for his earlier discoveries, so he was a very distinguished geographer and explorer, so he got his gold medal, and that was and then he said, I believe Mount Sinai is Arabia, and before this book was written, he wrote some other pamphlets about this, and there was correspondence in the Times newspaper of England, and he was declared to be a heretic, essentially. And so they took his gold medal away. It's the only time a gold medal has been taken away.
In the history
in the history of the Royal Geographical Society.
Really?
Only time, yes. Yes.
From that time until now, huh?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
Because, so that tells you that if people have ideas about the way things are supposed to be,
yes,
it's very difficult for anyone to come up with new information.
That is right. That is right. It's also true in the scientific field. You say something against the, accepted beliefs, it's quite hard to get your work published. It can be.
I guess not much has changed in the last 150 years. Even I had to decide if I was willing to explore the idea of a crossing at Aqaba, because some scholars told me, if you're going to talk about this, then I don't want to be involved. They had already decided how things happened. But my approach has always been to look at all the views and see if a pattern of evidence will appear that matches the biblical text, because that's what I'm investigating. What I know so far is that there is powerful evidence for the Israelites' departure point, that Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt in a southeasterly direction on a wilderness road, that they could have traveled a great distance across a desert, even with children and animals, that in numerous biblical references, the large number of people on the Exodus journey were provided for by God's supernatural care. And if God went to these lengths for his people back then, what does that mean for me and my family today? If I trust him in what appears to be impossible situations. In part 2 of the Red Sea Miracle investigation, I look forward to exploring the detour to the dead-end locations for the Gulf of Aqaba, and then on to the deep sea step. Does Yam Suf really mean the Sea of Reeds? Was it shallow or was it deep? And what would the parting of the sea look like in either the Egyptian or the Hebrew approach? If this is the Yam Suf, and they crossed this way, heading back to the ancient land of Midian.
Yeah.
If Moses was in this land, and they were heading this direction, and they turned back and went to this location.
Yeah. Okay. I think most scholars would argue and accept the fact that this is definitely also Yam Suf. The question is if there's more than one Yam Suf. If that sort of water can be moved by wind, even by miracle, what sort of miracle could do that? And what sort of people could stand the strength of the wind that would part that depth of water? Nobody could stand and walk that land bridge in that sort of wind. It would be impossible.
The Gulf of Aqaba is part of the Rift Valley, which stretches through Israel all the way to Africa. The depths of Aqaba reach down thousands of feet to the sea floor. If the Red Sea miracle happened here, it would be bigger than anyone could have imagined.
If this is the site of the crossing, we would expect to find physical remains of the Egyptian army.
on the seabed.
You bring me up one chariot wheel from the bottom of the sea there, and I'd be convinced.
We cannot minimize the location of the Exodus. These were waters that could destroy an entire army, that could be described as the very foundations of the earth.
Could the Red Sea miracle really have happened at the Gulf of Aqaba? Or did the crossing happen at the border lakes?
I think it is possible to demonstrate from inside the Bible itself that it took place in close proximity to Egypt. I think that's definitive.
The Bible tells you it's a natural mechanism. It's explicit.
If you had told me that somewhere near the Sinai, wind blows and splits the water, I could find it from there.
Make the sea small, put it close to Egypt, all of a sudden it calls into question the biblical text itself.
Do you think that there are such things as miracles that are actually supernatural, not just naturalistic?
Do you mean spectacular supernatural?
Today, we have hundreds of millions of people who claim to have witnessed miracles. And people actually who in our academic environment are sticking our necks out to talk about this.
What kind of miracle would either of these scenarios require?
It was something that God did to blow their minds. He could have delivered them 1,000 other less dramatic ways. He chose not to. He chose to do it in such a way that it was for maximum effect, that they would never forget it, that they would talk about it for millennia, because no one ever parts bodies of water.
I look forward to seeing where the biblical pattern fits best. This investigation has a lot more to uncover.